Hey everybody, it is Wintermute again with part 2 of the Crimsontide strategy analysis for the Commonwealth. So, just to reiterate, in that first video, there was a lot of little things I didn't go into, a lot of minor decisions that were made that kind of went into the overall strategy to start with, and of course, things changed. And I'm a big proponent of if you can't stick with a strategy from the beginning of the game, if it ain't working, you gotta read the game state and change things up. So I'm not going into, I might do a third video where I kind of go, okay, well, here's what happened during the game that I had to account for and some of the decisions I made that maybe weren't clear. But I'm going to continue with just kind of when I went into the game with at this point. And I'm going to talk about the expansions and how they impacted the game. And I will do a little bit of a discussion about, how they impacted the game. But first I want to talk about the tech choices that I made for the Commonwealth. Now, there almost is no tech on there that the Commonwealth wouldn't like to have. Now, the ground-based units are a little less desirable, like the heavy tanks or advanced mechanized. But, they're not useless. But, they kind of would like to have everything. Now, one thing I did prioritize, obviously, was wartime economy. That is a super important one for pretty much every nation on the board to get. And almost every nation rolls for it first. Now, I know there are some exceptions to it, and that's fair, depending on what your overall strategy is. But we also, and me and Panzer King, now Sky Marshal, and I'm still going to call him Panzer King for probably the next couple months or years till I get used to Sky Marshal. So bear with me. But there was one thing that I did that we talked about prior was trying to really do a heavy strategic bombing campaign against Germany and just damage their factories left and right. Now that never manifested. And, it was, I wasn't as sold on it as Panzer was, but I was perfectly willing to go for it. Absolutely. And I looked for ways to kind of really, really hammer it home, but the game just did not allow for that to manifest. So but I did go for long-range aircraft in part because of that in my mind. Now, I realized earlier that it would not have worked out, I would have gone for other things. I would have gone for one I really wanted was improved construction. Because I really relied heavily, very heavily on that South African factory to build units and get them up into Aden or directly move them up into Eastern Egypt, whatever the case is. Calcutta, same deal. I relied very heavily on Calcutta to produce artillery and things like that. And I really wanted improved factories because I wanted to double the production output of those 2 points without having to build another factory there. Because in some ways, a second factory in South Africa or a second factory in Calcutta with improved factories in some ways becomes a little bit of overkill, depending on the overall circumstances. So I was kind of like, and I debated building one in Egypt, but ultimately I opted not to. And there are other places where it might be useful for the Commonwealth to build a factory. And originally, I had not planned on upgrading the factory in Sydney. I was going to leave it a minor factory for the duration of the game. That was something that changed throughout the game. So I really wanted improved factories. Now, of course, improved shipyards improved construction is a very good one. Now, I was overconfident in my ability to end the war in the Atlantic early. So I did not pursue ASW or radar as the Commonwealth. Now, one problem the Commonwealth really suffers from is a severe lack of tech dice. And that's just a problem for the Commonwealth. I believe they should have more tech dice in the game in general. Because they only have 2 to start with. And, like I said, I wasn't even planning on upgrading the factory in Sydney until later on in the game as things developed. So I only had 2 rolls, and I rolled, I think, a little bit above average overall throughout the game. My early rolls were actually pretty good. But I did get wartime economy pretty early. I really was hoping to get improved factories earlier than I got it, but I still waited. But I only had 2 techs by the time the game wrapped up, barring anything Panzer King had rolled after that, after my Brexit. So I'm not sure what the final tally was as far as their tech goes, but they only had two techs compared to I mean that's a real uphill battle for them. So, but those were kind of my priorities: wartime economy, long range aircraft, and then improved construction. And then I had a kind of a secondary tier in my mind in terms of what was the other one? ASW possibly, radar possibly, but those were really really wishy-washy. Like I said, I was confident in my ability to kill subs quickly. It did not work out that way, and that's in part because the Canada War expansion made those subs so cheap, and that was something I had not anticipated. But that was why I chose a lot of the text that I did in the order that I did. Now, as far as the U.S. player goes and U.S. Lend-Lease, early on, Panzer said, I want to be the arsenal of democracy. You want it? Ask for it. I'm like, okay, I'm going to hold you to that. And for the most part, he was very gracious with his Lend-Lease. And we did talk extensively about, what was the best way to Lend-Lease. Was it cold hard cash? Was it a unit? The pros and cons of cash versus a unit. And back and forth, and whether and where it should go. Should some of it go down to India or in the FEC, or should some of it go straight, or should almost all of it go straight to Britain? Now, of course, almost all of it went straight to Britain as the game panned out. But we left ourselves very, very flexible as far as that goes. And for the most part, I mean, everything we'd wanted to do with the joint effort between the Commonwealth and America kind of played out fairly well. I did give some Lend-Lease help to him in South America. But overall, there was a lot of cooperation there between us, and I think that worked out pretty well. Now, that means, so I'm going to start talking about the expansions. Now, each expansion on its own deserves a deep dive, but I'm going to touch, I'll make a couple comments about their impact on the game here and there, but overall I want to kind of focus on what my thought process was going into the game. So, Turkey. Obviously, I wrote Turkey off completely. I didn't want to spend a single penny on Turkey. I do not regret that decision. Unfortunately, with a little bit of hindsight, there's a problem with that. But that has more to do with the way Italy works as a nation, and the way it plays as a nation, as opposed to the expansion itself. Of all the older expansions, I believe Turkey is one of the older ones, I think it's one of the ones that holds up the best with the current rule set, and is in least need of an overhaul in terms of just tweaking it here and there. I still think it works pretty well. Now, with that in mind, I honestly, as the Commonwealth said, I don't want to worry about it. I want all my money ready to fight Germany from the get-go. That's what I want. And you know what? We're going to go ahead and we're going to let Italy and Germany roll for Turkey all they want. I have a plan for dealing with Turkey if they get aggressive. And part of that plan was because Anatolia is the capital, not Istanbul. And it's actually, I know it's confusing, and even the expansion isn't as clear as it could be. But if you look, this icon roundel is kind of opaque. This one is opaque. This one is solid. So, like the other nations that have more than one territory, the solid one, the solid colored one, is the capital. This is the capital. And a lot of people miss that. And there was some discussion about that in Crimsontide as well. But knowing that was the capital, that meant even though Turkey has more units in this expansion than they would otherwise, they still have to be kind of spread all over the place because they have to defend Istanbul, because Istanbul is strategically really important and it's a city. But Anatolia has to be defended because it's the capital. If you lose Anatolia, you lose everything as Turkey. So part of my plan was I had Marines here, I had Marines here, I had a Marine here and there, so that, okay, if I really feel I need to make a concerted effort to knock Turkey out, I can go after Anatolia, or Kars even connects here, so maybe I can go knock Kars out and stop them from coming further into the Middle East, whatever it is they end up doing. Obviously, I couldn't predict that, so my overall strategy was part of that pivot. Okay, well, Turkey's becoming a problem. Well, Aiden, all right, he took Iraq. All right, well, Aiden can land in Iraq this way. All right, he came down and took Syria. Now, I left Syria Vichy explicitly to prevent him from being able to take Syria without causing problems of Free France or Vichy breaking away from the Axis. That was a deliberate move on my part. Okay, he goes into Iran. Well, okay, Iran will align, and then I can immediately start moving reinforcements into Iran, so he can't take southern Iran and the rest of it and push back. So I had a plan in mind to deal with Turkey, and I just didn't think it was worth it for me. I really wanted that money. Britain, another huge problem that the Commonwealth suffers from is they just don't have enough money to do everything they need to do. Unfortunately, Germany does. It has more than enough money to do pretty much everything it wants from the beginning of the game. And it only gets worse as the game goes on. And so for that reason, I wrote off Turkey. And I said, I don't think it's worth it. I don't think it's worth it. It's too risky. Let them get it. I'm not going to roll for it. Russia rolled for it a little bit. And we talked with Russia a little bit about the pros and cons of that. And he opted to puts a couple rolls into it just to scare Italy a little, just to make Italy kind of invest a little heavier. And ultimately, Italy did get it, and they did become aggressive with it. And unfortunately, the Commonwealth wasn't in a position to really deal with it at that point. But that was my strategy going in with Turkey. I had a plan for dealing with it, and I didn't feel it was worth it to invest the money into it or risk the money into it. So that's Turkey. The next one was China. Now, I still really like the China at War expansion. I think it's one of the better expansions out there, in my opinion. I gave it a glowing review, and I still hold with that review, but a couple things have come up with it. But overall, my strategy going into it was pretty straightforward as the Commonwealth player. I'm going to give supply tokens to China. They're a minimal investment for me for a doubling the value for China, taking these militia that would otherwise sit there, turning them into an aggressive unit, and letting them push, letting them go, letting them do their thing. And I had opted to, and we talked about this, and I had opted to, as long as I could get away with just giving you a supply token a turn, giving China a supply token a turn, that's what I was going to do. Now, there were turns that I went ahead and I gave them an artillery or infantry or whatever the case was, because that was just the better option. But I like the supply token mechanic. I like the mechanics for China at War. One problem with China at War is it really amps up the capabilities of the CCP and the KMT and gives them, and in theory gives them more incentive to go fight each other before Japan comes in. However, the reality is if you know Japan's coming, you still just don't fight each other. You just don't do it. And you saw it with Japan. Japan struggled a lot more in China than they would have otherwise because they had way more firepower available to them. Because not only could they get a Russian fighter and an American fighter over there, but now I'm giving them, at the very least, a supply token a turn, and later on, two with the transport. And then they're converting that militia that normally just sits back here doing nothing, and they're converting it into an offensive unit that they can push back with. So and that's still taking into account that the CCP players' roles were terrible in this game. And I feel so bad for War Heroes. But his roles for the CCP and his recruitments and whatnot and his alignments were just terrible. There's nothing you can do about it. So the KMT really carried that war pretty well. And were aggressive when they needed to be aggressive. And, they got their teeth kicked in eventually and things stabilized. But overall, I still think it's a really good expansion. And I really didn't have much more to offer it in terms, as the Commonwealth player, other than that Lend-Lease and how we were going to do that Lend-Lease. So yeah, that was kind of my view of China at War. So the next one is Canada. Now, it turns out Canada at War is a terrible expansion because Jinx just wrote it terrible. No, I'm kidding. There were a couple issues that came up with Canada at War. And I'll be honest, when I first read Canada at War, I wasn't that thrilled with it. I didn't think that I only saw the negatives. And so I talked with Jinx a little bit, and he kind of pointed out, well, think about it like this, and maybe like this. And I go, oh, okay, you know what? Now I feel better about playing with it. So I kind of realized how it would work. Overall, it's a good expansion that benefits the overall will benefit the allies, and sometimes in ways that isn't obvious. But at the end of the day, and even Jinx said, I'm going to end up updating it now that I've seen it played within Crimsontide a little more thoroughly, and seen some things that need to be tweaked here and there. Which is also the case for Latin America at War and the Colonial expansion. The designer for those two expansions was watching this game. We talked to him throughout the game. I'm still talking with him about, giving him some feedback on both expansions. And so Jinx is kind of in the same boat in that, he's going to tweak some of it. Overall, though, it was a pretty straightforward expansion. It gives, I obviously opted to move some Canadian units down here to Southeast Asia or very early to secure that wartime bonus income. Expecting to maybe lose it later as Japan came down. Well, that never quite manifested. So that was kind of, because I did that and I went out of my way to make sure that those units made it down here, that actually paid off in the long run. And obviously I put them in two different areas, one in Hong Kong, one in Malay, hoping to increase the chance or decrease the chances of them both being wiped out in one shot. The extra income that Canada gets and things like that. Now, obviously, I really didn't build any corvettes. I think that they need kind of a rework. I did use the Aerodrome of Democracy at various points, and particularly for the FEC, and Anzac benefited from that because they got some discounts, and it allowed me to free up that factory spot in Calcutta to build that transport up in Canada and then have it lend-lease down. So there were definitely some uses, good uses of the Canada at War expansion that were beneficial for the Commonwealth overall. Of course, Germany benefits hugely by that sub-discount, more than anything. So that's one that I personally think would need to be tweaked a little. But overall, yeah, I mean, Canada at War expansion is a pretty solid expansion. It just needs to be tweaked here and there in a couple ways. Now, Latin America at War, I have less to say about overall because I had less to do with it. This was Panzer's deal for the most part. Now, obviously, we talked about it, and we talked about the best way to go about it. The thing with this expansion is it was hard to kind of have a game plan in place for it, because a lot of it is dependent on a lot of what happens down here is dependent on what the German player is going to do down here. Is he going to invest money for the spy? Is he going to invest money for the towers? And then what does that cause America to do? And then on top of that, what's the random events going to do? Are the random events going to cause problems down here? And you saw them. They kind of ramped up things in a way we weren't expecting. And the designer was looking at that. And we talked with him extensively, and some decisions were made that there are some issues that came up with the way it played out that we just kind of had to work with as we went. But at the end of the day, it's a little bit of a hard expansion to kind of have an overall strategy for at this point because there is a lot of randomness involved in it. And so we just sort of dealt with things as they developed. And that's kind of how I kind of went into it. I didn't have a strong opinion on how it should play out. So the colonial expansion. Okay. This one was a little bit more controversial amongst our group because very early on, I saw a way to exploit something within it that would exacerbate an existing kind of thing within the rules, which is already a little gamey. I'm not going to go into a long detail about it, but ultimately the Gourmet unit was kind of rewritten a little bit, and we played him like you saw me play him, where I took a lot of the good stuff out of France and brought it down to northern Algeria, and then that became the capital, and that let the Free French kind of have an army to really fight with later on. Now, the rest of the expansion is solid. There's a couple things that I think need to be tweaked, and I've talked with the designer and given him some feedback. And most everybody in this game has at this point. But the real hot button unit was that Gourmet, and allowing all that stuff in its own territory to flip over to being Free French. Now, there was a lot of discussion amongst some of us within the group and other friends of mine who play the game beyond just Jinx and Panzer and everybody else involved in the game, there was a lot of discussion amongst us as to the pros and cons of it. And ultimately, in my opinion, the Gourmet is a bit over. It is way too good, and it boils down to this: I can take the entire French army out of France and have it live to fight another day, and not inflict a single casualty on the Germans, and have it at full strength to fight another day somewhere else. Or I can leave it in France and only half of it fights and the other half just gets taken off the board. Because you don't have to fight everything in France. All you have to do is either take Paris or surround it. But either way, there's absolutely zero reason the German player should ever have to fight through every unit within France. They only ever have to fight about half of them. So the Gourmet allowed me to preserve the good stuff for later, and I think it was a huge benefit for the Allies overall. I went sub-hunting with that stuff. I reduced the Vichy capabilities with it. I took Vichy money with it. I really was a constant threat against Italy doing whatever it wanted to do, whenever it wanted to do. And if I didn't do that, I would have nothing. And it's been argued, well, if you don't defend France, then Germany's extra strong. Okay, well, let me. I don't know what games. I've never seen France do a lot of damage to Germany. I just never have. And my strategy, even with France, was reflected in part. Now, this is what I was going to do anyway. Basically, I was going to take my French forces, divide them in half. Now, before the Gourmet was brought up. And I was going to basically put half of them in Paris, half of them in Alsace-Lorraine, or Picardy, depending on how things worked out. And at the end of the day, I was going to force the German player, you're going to have to fight through one of those stacks. I can't possibly make you fight through both. I can't possibly do that because there's just no way to... You always have the option to go the other way. So even if I did half my army here, a quarter here, and a quarter here, well, then he just comes into Picardy and then ultimately surrounds with paratroopers and whatnot. Or maybe, does both Belgium and Switzerland in a single turn and then completely overwhelms me. And you never have to fight through all of France's forces. So basically, there's a huge chunk of the French army that just never even sees combat. He just goes around them, takes Paris, or he ignores Paris and scoops up everything around it. So I would rather have as much of the French army survive at full strength somewhere else to threaten and push back later on in the game. Now, there's a lot more analysis to that could be done. But in general, that's how I looked at it. And quite frankly, people have said, well, what if Germany goes into Paris extra early? I'm like, great. No problems with that. The benefit to the Allies going to full wartime economy is more than enough to offset anything Germany gets out of that, in my opinion. Now, I have had people make very good arguments that it can be done and in a punishing way. That's another discussion for another time. And I believe that their analysis is correct. However, I still think that there are other factors to go into be taken into account for the entire thing. And it's a really complex thing. But ultimately, I am very happy with the decision I made to use the Gourmet the way I did. It worked out even better than I had anticipated. And one of my friends was even arguing, literally take everything out of France. Everything. Don't leave anything there. Invite the Germans in with open arms. I wasn't ready to commit to that. Now, I'd be perfectly happy to test that, to play test that. But I didn't want to do that within this particular venue. That's something that I would rather try just amongst friends. But the Gourmet, overall, the colonial expansion, I think overall the units in the colonial expansion are very powerful at their baseline. They're very useful. And yes, they do overwhelmingly favor the Commonwealth in terms of getting guys onto the board in a lot of different ways. So if you play with it, understand that the Commonwealth is going to get the lion's share. Now, as the Commonwealth player, I've said this before, I believe that overall the game is skewed against the Allies. And I actually think Crimsontide demonstrated that. But I was still thrilled to get all the benefit I could out of the Colonial Units expansion. And there was quite a bit of benefit out of it, even though I didn't get to leverage a lot of, I didn't do a lot of fighting with the Commonwealth. I just had a lot more assets at my disposal overall as the Commonwealth because of that expansion, and it felt good. God, it felt good. So that's basically kind of my analysis of going into these. And so to sum up the colonial expansion, that's what I went into it with. I knew basically France worked out pretty much exactly like I expected it to, actually better than I expected it to, in terms of the way the combats went within France itself, and having that strong army in northern Algeria that otherwise wouldn't have done anything in France, because there's no way the German player needs to fight through all of that stuff. They can just ignore half of it, more or less. So that was my strategy. And other than that, I had a lot of things with those colonial units. I was building them at particular locations. I had specific jobs for each one. Like, okay, I'm going to build this guy here on turn 2, pick up that transport, bring him over here, and he'll be ready to roll from here. I got to reinforce Gibraltar better. I got a couple extra guys. The extra guys in Africa itself is great. God, that felt good to have those guys down there ready to fight. And then many of them are cheaper and have extra abilities on top of that make them better within that theater. And then, even just starting with the guys on the Solomon Islands, I actually do build a militia on the Solomon Islands because it's worth a buck to the Japanese. I don't want to give them the free walk-in. Well, with the expansion, I get a guy there for free. Yay, I'll take that. That's $2 more for me that I would have otherwise had to spend. And then I get $3 for the Nigerian guy who ended up helping to defend Gibraltar. Beautiful. So overall, that's kind of my impressions of the expansions as I went into the game with them. Again, feel free to kind of bring up some points, ask me questions if you want me to clarify something. I know, and there's a lot to this. There was a lot more to this. I can't go through every little minute detail about this thought process and that thought process. Now, when I get to it, I will probably do a third video analyzing some of the major things that transpired within Crimsontide, and how they kind of affected the flow of the game and how I had to kind of change what I was doing. And there weren't many. There were enough that it's worth mentioning, but I don't know when I'm going to get to that video. It may not be for a couple of days. It may not be till next weekend. But so, like I said, any comments below or questions, feel free to leave them below. And for right now, this is Wintermute signing out of the think tank.